think we can go ahead and get started. Stephen and Rob, if you want, I think this is enough time for everybody to join.
Thank you, Diane. I'll go ahead and start. So my name is Robert Gropp, and I am the interim co-executive director for the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and I'm this talking head. And so I would like to first and foremost welcome you all and thank you for joining us for today's very important program. For those of you that may not know, this is the first in a series of 3 webinar programs that will be discussing some important research on the conduct of peer review and sort of looking at the various aspects that we all need to kind of consider to make sure that we are advancing science in the best way possible. The program is also part of a broader initiative that AIBS launched this year that we call Topics in Biology. This is a series of programs, monthly podcasts and webinars, as well as periodic in-person meetings to discuss timely and topical issues affecting biology, the conduct of science, and really all around aspects of ensuring that we have a vibrant, strong profession, but that we're also able as a collective and as a scientific community, able to inform decision-making and ensure that we're all working together to ensure that the scientific enterprise is strong, vibrant, and is doing what we all want it to do, which is advance knowledge and make significant contributions to society. So today's program, again, is the first of 3 online programs that AIBS has planned for the coming months on the topic of research on the science of peer review. So I hope that you'll find today's topic and program useful, valuable, and informative, and will join us for future programs. I also would like to just mention that today's program is made possible in part by AIBS members. We are a membership organization, among many other things, that includes both individual and organizational members. And it's through their contributions that we're able to bring these kinds of programs to the community. And so I hope that if you're not already a member after today's program, you'll consider joining with us as we go forward. It's with the financial support of our members that we're able to try and bring this kind of content to everyone. So with that, I don't want to go on much longer. I will turn the program over to Diane Bosanjak from our membership office, who will provide some guidance, I think, as to how the webinar platform works and how we'll go ahead and get started. And then from there, Dr. Stephen Gallo will begin his presentation. So again, thank you all very much. I appreciate your interest in today's topic and look forward to today's program and the questions that follow. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Again, my name is Diane. I will be here for any support that you have. Just a few reminders. This meeting is being recorded. We ask that you please mute your microphones and turn off your video streams just to help minimize the amount of connection issues or audio feedback that might occur. You will see in the far left corner of your Zoom screen icons for microphone and video, each with a line through it. That means they are turned off. If you do not see that line through it, just go ahead and click on the icon and the line should appear. If you have any questions or issues, please use the chat feature below and somebody from AIBS will assist you. There will be 2 Q&A sessions throughout the meeting. To ask a question, please type in your question in the chat feature and someone from AIBS will relay your question to the presenter. Again, if you have any issues or questions, please use the chat feature and I will respond to you as quickly as possible. Thanks again for joining the meeting, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Stephen Gallo.
Thanks, Diane. Let me see if I can get this working. Okay. So thanks, everybody, for the introduction. My name is Stephen Gallo. I'm the Technical Operations Manager here at AIBS in the SPARS department, which is the Scientific Peer Advisory and Review Services department. And we have actually AIBS as a whole has been conducting peer reviews for a wide variety of funding agencies and research institutes for over 50 years. And in doing so, it's afforded us kind of a unique opportunity to see a lot of different types of research funding mechanisms and peer review procedures. and to analyze those results and potentially contribute to the currently quite small body of literature that is dedicated to the peer review of grant applications. So hopefully through doing that, we can help to inform our own procedures and promote the integrity of the peer review process in general. So today, specifically, this webinar will be concerning the use of teleconferencing in peer review. As most of you probably know, more and more often, teleconferences and video teleconferences are being used as a mechanism to hold peer review panels to review grant applications. And this is driven by several factors, certainly one of which is cost. Another, of course, is convenience. Sorry, I think I just muted myself. I apologize. There we go. Okay. And another is the convenience to the reviewers. The problem, though, is that, the literature is lacking in studies exploring how this change in review setting affects the review outcomes of these peer review panels. Fortunately, though, there's a vibrant team science community out there, and there's a large body of literature about team performance, some of which specifically talks about distributed teams and their performance, and shows that team trust can actually be substantially diminished in distributed teams. And since trust is a key to successful collaborations, this is concerning to say the least. So potential impacts that using like a teleconference for using distributed teams on team performance is it depends very much. The impact depends very much on the type of task and the team longevity. So in other words, if you're talking about something like a persuasive task, that actually may be more susceptible to changes by differences in communication setting, as well as ad hoc teams are probably more influenced by communication setting than long-term teams. The reason being probably that long-term teams have more time to develop trust among its members. So let's see, sorry. So we suggest that in peer review panels, team trust may very well impact a variety of factors, including the reviewer perception of psychological safety, and that is probably best embodied in maybe a reviewer taking a risk by throwing out a perspective that's different than what the assigned reviewers have put out there, especially if there's a power differential or if there's a difference in seniority between those two reviewers. So that could be an important factor that gets impacted, as well as the effective management of different conflicts of opinion, team self-regulation, consistent use of review procedures, and the active engagement of reviewers in the decision-making processes. Okay. So this talk will be separated into essentially two parts. Both of these parts are based on recent publications. The first part is based on a publication in 2013 and +1, and the second one is based on a publication that was just recently accepted at the British Medical Journal, the open copy of it, which hopefully will come out sometime in September. Essentially, the first part deals with looking at the effect of communication setting on the review outcomes, at least in bulk. And then the second part will try and drill down into how discussion actually affects scoring shifts. And are those scoring shifts affected by communication setting? Sorry, and if everyone could please make sure they're muted, that would be very helpful, because I think we're getting some feedback there. Okay. So in general, this the data set is based on it's based on reviews that the AIBS conducted for a funding program, which we'll label as PRX. It's an anonymized funding program, research funding program that AIBS conducted peer review for over 4 years. Overall, there's 1,600 proposals that were reviewed. Sorry, someone's chatting. I see, sorry. Sorry, I'm still getting the hang of webinars. So this data set includes over 1,600 proposals over a wide variety of topic areas, including mostly biomedical research topic areas. The funding mechanism is somewhat similar to an R01, 3 years, 750K direct costs. And the panels are 7 to 12 scientists who are reviewing somewhere between 30 and 40 applications on a panel. Typically, each application is assigned a primary and secondary reviewer who assess these applications before the meeting and write initial critiques and initially score those applications. They bring those critiques to the meeting. Actually, they submit them through our online system. And then through, once the panel meeting is open, there's the primary and secondary reviewers give out their critiques and read their critiques to the panel, and then the discussion is open to the entire panel. And after the discussion, then all panel members vote on each application. And so we can actually, we actually have data from the initial assessments and the final assessments. It should also be noted that we don't encourage necessarily consensus, that reviewers are encouraged to vote their conscience, but that there's a place in the system for people to make comments, and we encourage people who are of, let's say, dissenting opinion, who don't agree with perhaps maybe the majority of the panel, to make sure that their voice is heard and that they express their opinions before they vote, so everyone can be on the same page in terms of how people are coming to their decisions. The scoring scale used was the old NIH scale, which is a 1 to 5 scale with a 0.1 gradation. So to back up, the reason that we examined this data set was in the period of 2009 to 2012, there was a shift in the review setting. In 2011 and 12, we moved to a teleconference only based review setting. Other than this, most of the review procedures and the programmatic guidelines, the amount of money that was in the pot, the types of mechanisms used, they all stayed the same. So we felt this was a good case to look at potentially how, if you flipped a switch and made everything into teleconference reviews, how that would affect the outcomes. It also should be noted, and I'll get to this later on, that in 2009 there was a particularly high proposal load. In terms of the overall score, so each application gets scored by, discussed and then scored by the entire panel, the average of which results in the overall score. So if we look at the average overall score of all applications reviewed during each year, again, 2009 and 10 were face-to-face, and 2011 and 12 were teleconference-based. We find that there are small differences between face-to-face and teleconference panels. Maybe slight, face-to-face reviewers are slightly harsher by about 0.1 or so compared to teleconference panels. However, if you look at the use of the scoring range or the scoring distribution, you find that they're actually remarkably similar. So indicating that the reviewers basically utilize the scoring range in a very similar way, independent of review setting. We can also look at the average standard deviation amongst those scores. So again, if all the panel members are voting on each proposal, there'll be a standard deviation that could be wide if there's disagreement among panel members. And as we see, if we take the average of that for each year of review, we see that there's a fair amount of variation and no consistent pattern showing that the effect of the communication setting was not did not affect the standard deviation or the contentiousness of the average contentiousness of proposals. Another way to get at this is the inter-rater reliability. We measured inter-rater reliability using an intra-class correlation coefficient. Because there are a high number of panelists voting on the overall score, this resulted in a pretty high reliability. But we've also looked at simply primary and secondary reviewers and how their scores ended up in the final scoring schema, and looked at their reliability and found that there was relatively no difference between face-to-face and teleconference panels. One other, sorry, I can't seem to get this thing to go away. One other parameter that we looked at was discussion time. And we looked at the average discussion time per application for each of these years, and found that there was a significant difference in average discussion time between face-to-face and teleconference panels, although this difference was a little bit more muted in the 2009 year. And we think we have a reason for that. We think 2009, as I noted, had a high proposal load compared to the other 3 years. And in fact, we found that in face-to-face meetings, at least, the higher number of proposals per panel, or the higher proposal load panels had, the shorter the average discussion time per application was. And this is likely due to the fact that over a 2.5 day meeting, reviewers have planes to catch. There's certain travel logistical things that come into play that help to try and push the panel to truncate discussion a little bit. And if you look at teleconference panels, this is not the case. So because 2009 was a particularly high year with about 28 applications per panel compared to 15 to 20 for 2010 through 12, we felt that this effect counteracted the effect of the review setting. Nevertheless, we found statistically significant differences between 2010 and 2011 and 12, the teleconference years, of about 8 to 10 minutes per proposal. I should mention here, before I get into the reviewer survey, that we also looked at reviewer demographics and found that, at least in terms of levels of seniority, degree, and male and female ratios, were very similar for face-to-face versus teleconference panels. We also surveyed reviewers to ask them to what extent they found the panel discussions to be fair and thorough, and found similar results for both face-to-face and teleconference. So in this first section, I think in general, we can say, at least for bulk parameters, the reviewer scoring, contentiousness, and reliability were either modestly affected or completely unaffected by the review setting. However, discussion time was lower for teleconference panels compared to face-to-face. And teleconference panels may very well have lower member engagement in discussion. And this may be due to the fact that at a face-to-face meeting, engagement might be fostered by visual social cues and opportunities for interactions. Reviewers can meet up at lunch or in the hallways and form at least tentative social bonds that help engender trust amongst members. So we'll move on to the next section, but before I do, we thought we'd split the questions and answers into two halves, just in case, because this is a lot of data dumping on you. So Diane, do you have any specific questions from?
I do. A couple people have asked if you can point them or maybe give them some, whether current literature on the peer review or maybe a bibliography of the stuff that you're talking about, if you're going to provide that, or if you can point them in the right direction or where to find that.
Sure. Actually, that's a good point. If you go to our SPARS website, we actually have a bibliography of peer-reviewed related data and papers relating to the peer review of grants, and it's separated out by types of topic areas like conflict of interest, or peer review, the validation of peer review scores, or bias in peer review. So we've kind of separated them out and tried to group a series of publications together. And so that's on our website. There's a bibliography section that should have all of that laid out for you. But if not, feel free to email me if you have a specific question, and I'll be more than happy to get back to you and email you with a specific publication if I know. Also, I should probably mention, I think I even have it here. There's a very good book, although it's about 10 years old. There's the Peer Review in Health Sciences has a large section on peer review and grant applications. It's edited by Fiona Godley, who's now, I think, the editor of the British Medical Journal. But she's one of the people who helps organize the International Congress on Peer Review, which happens every 4 years. And that book, even though it's about 10 years old, still contains quite a lot of good information in it as an overview of peer review of grant applications. Was there another one?
Yes, there was, and I went ahead and typed in the URL for the.
Oh, thank you. That's great.
And then the question was: you said the reviewers came with a score, which they could change after the discussion. What was the correlation between the pre and post scores? Yeah,
so that's actually the part 2 that we'll be getting into in just a second.
Okay. And Eleanor asked, can we get the name of the book, Peer Review in Health Sciences?
Yes, Peer Review in Health Sciences. It's edited by Fiona Godley and Tom Jefferson. I don't know it's BMJ Books, I guess. We can send that out as well. I think that's actually in the bibliography section as well. So if people want to look at that.
Okay. Were the review panels happy to embrace change, or were there any concerns on trying teleconference?
On trying teleconferences? Well, so these, I should have probably emphasized a little bit more that these were ad hoc panels, so they weren't long-standing panels. So membership was constantly kind of renewing, although there were some returning members. There was certainly a lot of new membership. And so, we recruited based on people's availability and their willingness to participate. So to some extent, their willingness kind of drove the willingness to review under those circumstances, was part of the driver for recruiting them.
Okay. Were there any noticeable differences between areas or multidisciplinary versus focused panel areas?
That's a really good question. That is something that actually we haven't explored yet. Most of these panels are focused topic areas, but that said, many times they can be focused on a specific disease, which can encompass a lot of different types of research. Anywhere from basic to all the way through translational. Though there are no clinical studies per se, it's still a wide variety of types of models. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we saw, there was variation across panels, but we didn't specifically look at that, but that's an interesting point for sure.
How did you coordinate discussions on teleconference with 7 to 12 participants?
We used software much like this, and the one thing that I think peer review has going for it is I think most peer reviews, including ours, the procedures, most of those procedures are fairly well structured, where people go through different phases of the review, and they go through the kind of same procedure for reviewing each proposal, so that you get some sort of consistency. And as a consequence, that helped considerably when you're running a teleconference panel. People can interact directly. Also, the software where most of the review occurred, where people entered scores, entered their critiques, was an online software, so that made it easy as well.
Are there any comment on ideal number of reviewers per application, usefulness of written reviews as part of the process?
I'm sorry, could you say that one again?
Sure. Any comment on ideal number of reviewers per application?
Oh, I see.
Or usefulness of written reviews as part of the process?
Yeah. Oh, in terms of ideal number of proposals per panel, probably, as you saw, at least for face-to-face panels, if you start to overload people too much, once you get much past 30, I think 30 or 35, it starts to probably truncate the discussion time a little bit. But while that didn't happen as much for teleconference panels, you still do get reviewer fatigue. So it's probably better to focus on that, but it really depends. Different people have different procedures, and we didn't have much of a triage process. We pretty much reviewed everything. So I know other agencies have pretty stringent triage processes where they get rid of quite a lot of the proposals. So, but yeah, we didn't employ anything like that. In terms of written critiques, I guess I missed the point on that one, but
it was two different questions. So the per application, the next question was the usefulness of written reviews as part of the process.
Yeah, I think that it was very useful because in our system, as well as in others, I think everyone can view the initial assessments. They can even view them before they come to the meeting, so they can kind of get a sense of what it looks like. And that's a feature that's been particularly useful for when we've been using consumer reviewers, because sometimes they need to get their feet wet and to get a sense of what the other reviewers how the other reviewers are looking at a particular application through a scientific lens compared to more consumer lens.
All right, we have one more question. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, go ahead.
Okay. You mentioned that there was less engagement on the TCON panels. What was the evidence for that? Or is it just based on observing that discussion time was less?
It's just based on discussion time, but we'll get a little bit more into the details. So why don't I go ahead and move on to the second part of this, and then we can probably, some of those questions will be answered. Probably there'll be more generated, but anyway. So the second section was really to drill down into a subset of this data. The way the data was collected, as I mentioned, through our online system, it was a little bit more difficult to get at the initial scoring of each application compared to the overall score. So we had to kind of focus a little bit more on a subset of data. We also, we also had to focus on we tried to focus on a subset of topic areas. So ultimately, we wanted to look at how the effect of that discussion, since discussion time was found to be potentially an important factor, how did the effect of that discussion, how did it affect the scoring shifts before and after discussion? And was this effect mitigated in any way through having a face-to-face panel versus a teleconference panel? So some studies have looked at the effect of discussion on peer review scoring. Most notably, Martin et al. Did a paper on NIH work, and also a group in Europe, Fogelholm. But no one has particularly looked at how this relates to communication setting. And in addition, while there's a lot of team performance literature out there about decision-making and teamwork and the effective communication setting, there's nothing really specifically looking at that in the peer review process, particularly with how this affects discussion. So anyway, that was our impetus for exploring this a little bit more. Again, this is a subset of PRX data of topic areas that were consistent across the 2009 to 2012 timeframe. All biomedical in nature. And we specifically tried to focus on looking at the average of the initial scores. So the primary and secondary reviewers, we took the average of those two scores. That was what we would call APS, the initial score. And those initial scores and critiques were presented to the panel before discussion. And then the panel engaged in discussion. And then after discussion was over, the entire panel rescored the proposal, and every panel member voted. In that case, we called that average the OS, or the overall final panel score. And so the effect of discussion in our study was measured as APS minus OS, which we deemed as delta A. And so you'll see that terminology over and over again in these next couple slides. But that's what delta A is, essentially the effect of discussion on the scoring shifts. And so to answer one of the questions, this is how the initial scores relate to the overall scores. They're actually fairly well correlated in both review settings, although they're a little bit more spread out in the face-to-face setting compared to the teleconference setting. So, and this is reflected in the mean squared error, which is here, which kind of gets at the how grouped the data are. It's also reflected in the percentage of primary and secondary reviewer scores that shifted post-discussion. So close to 60% or so for face-to-face panels, while closer to 45% or so for teleconference panels. In terms of, sorry, can people still hear me? I just got a notification on my computer.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. It told me my speakers were shifting, so sorry. In terms of the score shifting, in terms of the direction, the majority of applications shifted in a negative direction post-discussion. So 54 to 57% of both face-to-face and teleconference panels had an effective discussion that was negative. So the scores actually worsened after discussion. So with about 20 to 25% being positive and about 20% unchanged, where delta A actually equals 0. In terms of the magnitude of that effective discussion, there was a significant difference between both the applications that shifted in the positive direction and applications that shifted in the negative direction. In both those cases, the magnitude of delta A was larger for face-to-face compared to teleconference panels. So this, in part, kind of underscores the theme, which is that I think in teleconference panels, the resiliency of that discussion is probably a little bit more muted, and certainly the effect of that discussion on ultimately reviewers changing their scores and maybe convincing them one way or the other is a little bit more muted in teleconference panels. But again, those are small differences. These delta A's are actually pretty small, relatively speaking. In terms of discussion time, we looked at, again, average discussion time per application, and we found in this subset of data that it was also, we found the same thing, very representative of what the master data set had, which was face-to-face panels had a higher average discussion time per application than teleconference panels. However, we found a very poor correlation, something like 0.1, sorry I didn't put the graph here, 0.1 or 0.2 correlation coefficient for discussion time between delta A, or the effective discussion, and discussion time. So it didn't seem like they were highly correlated. In terms of putting these kinds of differences in some sort of practical importance, we looked at how these score shifts changed over, let's say, a potential funding line of 1.8. So we assumed that there is a line in the sand that allowed the funding of a proposal or not. And it looked as if, in both directions, we looked at shifts, and it looked as if somewhere between 10 to 13% of applications shifted over the funding line in either direction. The majority shifted from fundable to unfundable. So, and that's in keeping with our finding that most delta A's are in fact negative, go in the negative direction. And so this 10 to 13% is fairly consistent with what Martin et al. Have found in his NIH study. Also, 30 to 50% of applications we found crossed over the funding line with relatively small delta A's, which is not a surprise since in general the average delta A's were pretty small. So in conclusion, the effective discussion was relatively small in both settings, but there were small and statistically significant differences between face-to-face and teleconference in terms of the delta A, in terms of the effective discussion on score shifting. And we hypothesized that this is possibly due to a decreased engagement in decreased reviewer engagement in the peer review proceedings, and possibly lowered team trust. And we chalked this up to possibly absence of visual social cues and opportunities for interactions, as I mentioned before, that are present in face-to-face settings. And again, because these are ad hoc panels, that might be exacerbated. discussion time in either setting had little influence on the magnitude of the effective discussion in terms of score shifting. However, we don't really know a lot about the quality of those discussions in terms of what kind of team processes are happening during those discussions. Is there a lot of conflict resolution? Is there, we just don't know who's saying what and how long are they saying it for, and who's convincing who of what. We only kind of know these kind of more numeric representations of that. So certainly future work ought to be spent there. And finally, delta A was much more often negative than it was positive, so there was a worsening of score. And we feel that that's probably due to the fact that persuading other panel members of the potential merits of a proposal is a lot more difficult than focusing on the less abstract weaknesses and logical flaws. So if you really have some specific methodological problems with what's being proposed, it's easy to point those out. It's a little bit harder maybe to extol the virtues, which may be more kind of esoteric and subjective. In terms of future directions, as I mentioned, certainly team dynamics and team processes should be examined, because I think we're only getting at kind of these proxies of what's happening, but we don't really know. Our hypothesis here is that the interactions and team processes are a little less resilient in teleconference panels as compared to face-to-face. And but more needs to be done to explore those kinds of things, potentially in a prospective way, which is another big problem in the area of peer review science, is that there's only a handful of prospective studies done. Almost everything is done in a retrospective way, so it's harder to control for things. So in addition, of course, we'd like to look at team trust, which is the team science literature has shown that's to be diminished in distributed teams, at least in many distributed teams. And particularly may be interesting to look at ad hoc panels versus long-term. And based on these characterizations, potentially we could create some interventions to increase team trust and reviewer engagement, and maybe even inoculate ad hoc panels from some of the potential problems we might see with them. And also, further exploration of the relationship between the properties of the funded applications and the review setting should be explored. Like, how do we know whether, if there are certain proposals that are high risk, high reward, are those the types that float to the top in teleconference panels compared to face-to-face? It's not sure if there perhaps is more or less of a bias towards high risk in these two settings. And so those are the kinds of things that probably need to be explored. I think in general that's mostly what I had to talk about. So maybe we'll go ahead and take the remaining questions, which looks like there's a bunch.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and still review over the ones that we didn't address the last round.
Sure.
So you might have answered these during your presentation, but I just want to make sure that I voice them.
Sure.
Was there any change in the number of challenges from declined applicants from those assessed via telecon?
No, I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Sure. Was there any change in the number of challenges from declined applicants from those assessed via telecon?
Oh, I see. I don't know. That's an interesting point. I don't think so. I think in general, the number of challenges is pretty rare, actually, and probably occurred with about the same frequency in both teleconference and face-to-face. But it's not something I explicitly looked at, but just my gut feeling tells me that's true. It is pretty rare, actually, that people make a challenge.
Okay. In terms of recruiting reviewers for panels, is there a difference in recruiting success when panels are run in person via teleconference?
Right. So as we addressed earlier, I think the demographics of the panels looked fairly similar. I can't speak directly to the rate of acceptance per se, although that is an interesting thing to potentially look at, is the percentage of people who said yes. I think certainly there's a convenience level that allows you to use people, particularly from the West Coast. If we're an East Coast operation, it's a little easier to do that, because those people it may be more difficult for them to fly in for a meeting.
We had a clarification from that one question that we weren't sure about, the usefulness of written reviews. So to clarify, I was asking the ideal number of reviewers assigned to each application. Should all members review each application or some subset of the panel only?
I see. Yeah, that's this is a big debate. I mean, certainly the more people you have explicitly reading it, the better the reliability. Part of the problem, though, is that, as you know, the number of proposals that are in the system seems to be just ever increasing. And so the load on reviewers is just tremendous. And people tend to do quite a lot of reviews for not only for journals, but also grant reviews. And so there's a limit to how much you can stretch them. So there's a fine line between you have to strike a balance, I guess, between what the optimally it'd be better if everyone read every proposal, but it's just not logistically possible. Yeah, I think 2, maybe 3. It depends on the type of proposals, but I think 2 actually works reasonably well.
Okay. Regarding short shifts, would you say that more discussion compounds the negative comments and thus lowers final score?
We didn't find any clear relationship between discussion time and score shifts. There was a little bit of a tail on either end of the, well, mostly actually on the negative end, near the 5 range, where there was maybe a noticeable relationship between discussion time and the magnitude of score shifts. And that is the case when proposals are fairly bad. People do like to kind of beat a dead horse. And so that is a phenomena that we kind of actively have to work against.
Could you comment on the possibility of too much team trust leading the homogeneity?
Too much team trust,
and even facilitating gaining strategies. Too much team trust. Can you comment on the possibility of too much team trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I suppose if maybe you're talking about like a long-term panel that's been on the same panel for so long that maybe they kind of reinforce each other's biases, that could be potentially a problem. You don't want so much, I guess, comfort with each other that people are unwilling to I mean, you do need new blood in panels, I think, on a regular basis. They bring new perspectives and fresh perspectives. So I think in that respect, I think maybe there's an advantage to ad hoc panels. And also ad hoc panels bring, specific expertise to the specific proposals that are submitted. So that's also a huge advantage. Yeah, so there could be a potential for I don't know if I'd say it's too much team trust, but maybe over comfort in in how the panel is run, I guess. So yeah, I would say you'd probably have to strike a good balance there too.
Okay, so in teleconference mode, one-on-one comments and exchange of ideas was in text mode by sending over to panel. Is that a fair statement? Also, what could be the reasons for a wider range of face-to-face versus telecon for the switch? I don't know. For the switch is the INSI. I'm not sure what that NC. I'm not sure what that meant, but so pretty much teleconference mode, one-on-one comments and exchange of ideas was in text mode by sending over to the panel. Is that a fair statement?
I'm not exactly sure what that question was, but there are virtual panels that exist that I know NIH has run virtual panels in the past that don't meet, and I don't think they discuss over the phone. They discuss via chat and things like that. So there is some of that. And we actually have that function, the conferral function that people can use to chat before the meeting. And like I said, particularly useful for when we use consumers, because many of them are coming at it from such a different angle that it's helpful for them to kind of see what the other people have read and to ask questions about it.
Okay. For future direction, do you plan to step out from looking at the dynamics of teleconferences versus face-to-face to look at the potential difference between the two in advancing, supporting quality science, i.e. downstream is one form of teleconference, face-to-face leading to a more rigorous and reproducible science?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. That's I think we have to look at the properties of these individual proposals and potentially in retrospective studies look at the potential impact of what was funded and what was chosen and what was given what score. And there have been, we actually have done a study on that, as well as NIH has done studies on that. The problem with that is measuring an impact of a particular proposal is difficult. Bibliometric metrics are I think are a good proxy to use in some respect, but they also have downsides. And so one of the things we've been able to see that there is some correlation between kind of the total impact the grant has made compared to the score that it received during peer review. But there have been some studies at NIH that showed that there's really not a strong correlation. And then there have been some other studies at NIH that have shown that there is some correlation, but there's a lot of variability in those measurements. And so it's I think more, we also have to come to grips with what type of metrics and what do we consider gold standards for the output of peer review. And one interesting thing, just as kind of tangential, but as mentioned at the recent team performance or team science meeting at NIH, it's not only worthwhile looking at how to validate the peer review process with inputs and outputs. It's also useful to look at processes. And that's one of the things that we were suggesting here, is to look at actually how team members interact with each other, how those processes are occurring, and is there a robust discussion? And because that's one of the things that the peer review panel is supposed to do, is to help reduce bias and allow for lots of different perspectives to be laid bare on a particular proposal or problem. And so I think, investigating the actual processes of peer review are also extremely important and can serve as a validation of sorts. Okay. Sorry, I don't know if that answered that question at all, but.
Can you repeat the number of score shifts over the funding line, and did more projects go from fundable to non-fundable in face-to-face or teleconference?
Yeah, it was, I can go back. Let's see. It was 10% for face-to-face and 13% for teleconference. And certainly the majority shifted from fundable to unfundable. And that's, as I said, consistent with the fact that most delta A's, the majority of delta A's, the majority of score shifts moved in the negative direction.
Okay. And also, somebody asked, I may have missed this, but did the teleconference include video of each reviewer or just audio?
Just audio, yeah. So that's actually a very interesting point, because there may be visual social cues that could be caught up by in a video teleconference. The one thing that's missing from a video teleconference compared to a face-to-face, of course, is that kind of social interaction that happens in hallways and bathrooms and lunch and all the other different kind of opportunities for interaction at a meeting that you don't get when you just take a 5-minute break and turn your webcam off to go to the bathroom or whatever. So it's, those are the kinds of things that we think might help strengthen team trust.
Okay, I'm going to read this question. Scott Gleason, who's the director of SPAR, has already answered it, but I'm going to read it in case you have anything to add to it. Do you let the reviewers read the other critiques before and after they finish their own critiques? And Scott's reply was, reviewers are only able to read their own critiques after they have completed their own.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm sorry. It should have been more clear. The conferral process is set up in a way that It's usually set up so that 48 hours before the meeting, once someone has completed all the sections in the kind of what we call the form and guide, or the template that all the different criteria, once someone's answered all of those things and completed a full critique, only then can they see what the other person has written. And in fact, to tell you the truth, it's something that actually most reviewers don't always use on their own accord. There have been many situations where typically it's better used if reviewers are prompted a bit, kind of reminded that someone's updated their critique and you should go back into the system and check up on it. But in general, I think it's nowhere near a replacement for either audio or video discussions, and I think probably data from NIH has probably agreed with that.
Okay. Did you survey reviewers to ask which they preferred, face-to-face or teleconference?
I think actually mostly we asked whether they felt the things about whether the procedures were fair and whether the how it compared to face-to-face, but I'm not sure we asked specifically what their preference was. So that might have been a drop ball in that respect. But I think actually just from a qualitative level, from speaking to people, I would say that it's about 50-50. I mean, some people really like the flexibility. Other people very much like the networking opportunities and feel like they get a more rich discussion, and they also get to kind of make connections at these meetings. So, I mean, I think it's about, in terms of preference, I'd say it's probably 50-50, but it may depend very much on where you live and where if you're always traveling to the East Coast for grant meetings, it may be burdensome if you're living in California.
Are teleconference peer reviews spread out more over days, possibly lessening peer fatigue and increasing the scoring consistency between the first to the last reviews?
Yeah, that's a possibility too. One issue with that, though, is that all reviewers are busy, and it's harder to actually recruit people who would be willing to spend 3 or 4 days reviewing 30 proposals as opposed to 2. That said, I mean, if it produced a better product, that would be better. But I think it's this issue where everyone's facing, where the number of proposals and the general reviewer load is getting higher and higher, and people have more weight on their shoulders. And so you have to weigh both. And so that's one of the reasons why it's very important that they do come up with potential different ways to validate the peer review process, so we can actually see which way is actually providing us with better choices. Because if we're getting better and more innovation and more consistent, reproducible kinds of results from face-to-face versus teleconference panels, then it may very well be worth the money and the inconvenience. But at this point, we really don't know.
Okay. Why do you think that more proposals crossed over the funding line in teleconference when the delta was larger in the face-to-face?
Why do I think that
more proposals crossed over the funding line in teleconference when the delta was larger?
I see.
Face-to-face.
Yeah, that's true. More of those deltas were, as we said, 50% of the teleconference applications crossed over with a small delta A. Yeah, there was a larger percentage of applications that actually ended up shifting. So one is that I guess the magnitude. The problem is that a lot of these, that a small difference in scoring can really make a big difference in terms of fundability. And second, I think actually, as we saw in the kind of global scoring distributions, face-to-face were slightly, there were some slight differences in average overall score. So you could say that maybe face-to-face were slightly more harsher graders. And so as a consequence, if you make a funding line in the sand, if there may be more proposals shifting because there were more proposals as a percentage that were above that funding line to begin with. So there's a higher number of proposals that were 1.8 or better to begin with, and so more of them shifted. I think that's what that's due to.
Okay, I think, any other questions? Possibly, anybody?
Well, if anyone does have any questions, further questions, please feel free. I'm not sure. I think, my email is right here, and I think it might have been attached to the information we sent out earlier. But if not, please feel free to email me with any questions. I'd be happy. I enjoy talking about this kind of thing, and also, we're really at the beginning. There's really not a lot of data out there regarding the peer review of grant applications. So there's a lot of different directions that need to be explored. So I'm always excited to hear other potential avenues. So thank you very much for your interest and for your attendance today.
And we will put this, the recording will be available. So if somebody asks if the slides will be available, so you can always go back and re-listen to the great presentation if you'd like. And our next webinar is going to be in September. The exact date is, I blanked, I believe it's the 17th. September 17th, the topic is Scientific Societies Preparing for the Future, and that will be at 1 p.m. And then our next, after that, we will have one October 15th, and that is evaluating merit review, conflicts, and bias in peer review, and that will be on the 15th, again at 2 p.m.
That's great. Thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.